In this video, I'm going to talk about how I made the battens and installed them. So here I'm just showing my stock of batten boards that I ripped. Some of these actually have the shear too, but so I used 4/4 stock, but it was finished to roughly 7/10 of an inch thick, or maybe close to 3/4. So I use the same jig for making scarf joints because my boards that I bought were not long enough, and so it's the same jig I've used for other scarf joints. And again, notice I don't have a guard on here, so you got to be really careful when you're doing this. So this 3/4 plywood and this piece of lumber, this is actually attached to it from underneath, and then I clamp the board that I'm needing to cut the scarf joint, and this is of course holding at an angle, and so it makes a really nice scarf joint when you do that. And if you want to see more details about that, I check out some of my other videos, like how I made the stringers and chine and shear. I think I talk more about this jig and show a few more pictures about it. So the way that I cut the notches for the bottom battens is or at least for the ones that I could, I actually used my skill saw, and I made this jig that the saw would set on, and then the way the blade kind of sits in, I had to set the depth and everything just right, and I just cut little slices at a time, and it actually worked really well. And then you can see my dust collector hose back here. I kind of held that while I was doing it. Here later on, what I ended up doing is actually putting in a cardboard box kind of underneath here to help contain the dust. And so here's a picture just showing my skill saw setting on that jig. And the way that I made it is the skill saw, I mean, I could slide it forward and backwards without it, so it held the blade, held the cut and everything, and I could also slide it side to side. I have these spacers and things, and it would only go as wide as I wanted it to. And so I attached these spacers. This picture is showing clamps, but I ended up adding screws like I did up here on this guide piece. So here's just showing that with the screws in there instead of the clamps. And so you could just slide the saw on this picture left and right, and then side to side, and it really cut actually really nice and clean notches for the ones that I could. Once I got to areas of the boat where the frames were too angled or whatever up towards the front, I wasn't able to use this jig, but I used it as much as I could. So this is showing the cardboard box underneath, just to help contain all the dust and wood chips and things. And then you made this, cut a hole in the side with my dust collector to kind of help. So that helped some, not make such a big mess. And then I would clamp, when I used it, clamp the jig to whatever frame I was working on. So here's just showing another picture where I'm ready to cut this notch right here. And there's the box and things to help contain the dust and the chips. And the other thing too to note is there were some times where I actually hit a screw, and which obviously the saw blade didn't like that too much, but it still cut through it fine. These are bronze screws, and so it didn't really hurt anything except for the blade. So there you can see I was able to use that jig on all these notches here and here, and I think even up in here. But once I get up in this area, I think I actually was able to use it all the way up into this frame too. So so it worked well. So here you can see that I'm getting more of the notches cut out. I was not able to use the jig on these outer, actually, yeah, these frames are angled too much, but these outer notches here, even because of the chine, got in the way of the jig. But so then what I used is a combination of this Japanese pull saw, and then I used this rasp to do the rest of these notches. And you can kind of see, you know, these actually were, yeah, they're not as clean as the ones where I used that skill saw jig, but clean enough. Because when you glue epoxy and battens in here, as long as the depth and the width is about right, it's not as critical. I mean, they don't have to be perfect. and also what I'm doing is starting to fit these battens towards the front to see how they're going to bend down and where they're going to land, and so we'll look at some more. I've got pictures coming up where I'm doing more of that. So, and the way that I did it is, if you notice, they're not twisted, so the long side ends up being mostly flush with the stem. Just the way mine bent and things, I just sanded off, made this edge or this side so it was a nice flush surface, but it's not the full width of the batten, and which that's okay. But you want a good surface, because when you epoxy and you screw them in, it still holds well. But so you have to kind of see how your battens are, and it depends on where exactly your notches were, or where your notches are, is how, you know. So the way when you do this, it's to be different for every boat. So what I'm showing here again is I'm epoxying my scarf joints and just using the boat. I did this for other pieces with my chine and shear and keel and everything, so just using the boat as my work surface. Getting those all epoxied. This is just another picture showing that, and so what I would do is clamp on either side of the joint that I was actually epoxying, so it wouldn't slide, because when you clamp a scarf joint like this, the pieces want to slide apart. And this is just showing I actually needed to do an additional scarf joint for a couple of these, because I needed an extra 1.5 feet or so. So I'm just doing that letting it hang off the back of the boat, and here's another one here that I'm doing as well. And this is showing where I cut the limbers, and I just used my Japanese pull saw, and I just cut angles like that. Some people use a router, and I just don't use a router very much, and I would have had to make a jig, so I just cut angled limbers like this. And you want to make these, when you do the limbers, you want them on the high side, which would be the outside, because remember, when you flip the boat, the keel is the lowest part, and then you don't need limbers on the low side, because there'll never be water there, but there could be water, you know, on the high side of any of these battens or the keel. You can see the limbers in the keel, but chances are there won't ever be water up in this area, but towards the sides, but down in this area towards the keel there could be. So this is just showing I've got all of them in place and epoxied, at least back in this area. Up front, I don't believe I've finished the epoxying of those, but and then here you can just see I'm in the process still of epoxying that last scarf joint. And so now I'm at this point fitting these up towards the front, seeing how it's going to land, how they're going to land on the chine logs. And you can see this board and this board, the angles are kind of a little bit different, but also what you want to keep in mind when you're positioning these is just remember you're going to be fairing off this edge, so you have to kind of guess at where roughly you want to you want this angle to be up in this area, and so you have to sort of do a little trial and error, and you can see these inside surfaces that will then get attached right to the stem. So there's some trial and error here to get those angles and things right. And so now what I'm showing is how I cut the notches for the side battens, and I use this battery powered skill saw, smaller one, and it's much lighter, and then I cut notches with it, and you can see what those look like. And so just little by little, and then I used a chisel then to chisel them out, and then to clean it up, I think I use this, you can see this rasp and file to clean those notches up. I'm just showing the top of a scarf joint, one of the battens, just to kind of show what it looks like. They turn out pretty clean. When you cut them with a jig like I did in my skill saw, those scarf joints really line up and match up very nicely. And here's a side view of that scarf joint, just to kind of show you what it looks like and what you want. If you notice, there's this layer of epoxy, and that's what you want, just a nice layer of epoxy in there. You don't want to over clamp these, and I think I talked about that in other videos, but that's what you want, is a nice joint like that. So here what I'm showing is I'm fitting these side battens, and I'm trying to get a feel for how they're going to bend and go up front. They are not epoxied in yet. These clamps, these are scarf joints that I've done. I did not epoxy the scarf joints on the side of the boat. I'm just using these clamps to reinforce, just to provide a little bit of extra strength while I'm test fitting these, because there's a little bit of bend here, but not a lot, but some. And then when I bend these in, it puts a little bit of stress on here. I just wanted to make sure that I let these fully cure before I added stress to them. So here I'm just showing I'm epoxying some more scarf joints for the side battens and using the boat again. This picture shows, now you can see how these side battens are landing on the stem. And again, you want to make them land not up flush with this edge up here, because that's going to get faired off. So you have to kind of guess. You want this outer surface to be roughly where you think the fairing is going to be. So you just kind of have to guess. And what I did before I landed the chine logs is I just did a little bit of fairing in this spot to give me a feel for where I was, and then I was able to kind of just guesstimate the rest of these. I use a similar dimension from this edge back and here. And then you can see these are not perfectly landing on the stem as far as its full width, and that's okay, because they don't need to be perfect, but you do want a nice flat surface as much as possible, and then they'll be epoxied and of course screwed in. And also, if you notice, this, which is the bottom batten, which will be the top one when you flip the boat, is landing really close to the bottom of the shear, which doesn't hurt anything. It's just how mine turned out. So this is just showing that side batten. And I noticed in here I was not going to be able to get a good surface, a big enough flat surface to take on this for holding, because there's a fair amount of force here to bend these in. And so then what I did is I made another piece to go in here, and then I epoxied and screwed that in, which I show that here coming up. And this clamp, you can see you have to get kind of creative up in front here to figure out how to sort of clamp to the other side to hold these in. And as far as the bend of these battens, again, you want to use nice straight grain wood, and so when you bend them, they don't break. So here's just showing kind of what that piece looks like. That actually is genuine mahogany, but it's obviously a lighter piece than this piece is. But so I just showing kind of what that inside surface. So this gives a nice flat surface for this piece to attach to. And this is just showing the other side. I had made the piece on that side. So I'm just doing dry fitting, and that is just showing how I'm going to screw it in. I think I ended up only with one screw, but the epoxy is what does the full holding power. So how far back from the front of the boat, you just have to, like I show in this picture, you just have to fit and feel and cut this angle, and so there will be some surface attached to the stem here, but then the rest I'll get a nice surface attaching on that surface of that little piece to provide enough holding power. And then you can see I'm back a little ways from that edge of the stem. So then when I epoxied this, I epoxied down below here and to the stem, so it was held in real well. And this is just showing how these battens, the bottom battens, again, I have epoxied them in, and I actually put 3 screws on this side. I might have given up on this screw and went to I screwed too far back, made a hole too far back, but you can see how those are going on there. And then these battens just kind of go up and stop. They don't land anywhere. And then I just ferret off as needed. And then you can also see these are now epoxied and screwed in, these 2 battens, this one and this one. So it just takes trial and error. And this picture is showing most of the battens, side and bottom, are in place now. And so this is before fairing, but you can see how they turned out. And this again just showing another picture from the front. Most, I think they're all pretty much attached. I'm letting the epoxy cure on these up here. Just another picture. One thing to notice, if you look, when you cut these notches for the side battens, there's a bit of trial and error, and sometimes I had to use a little spacer. Actually, you can see that spacer there when I epoxied this in, and then that just gets ferred off. And there are a few spots where I had to do it because it does. You have to kind of just work your way into it, and but I did use some shims and spacers because it's just tough to exactly see how to cut those notches even when you're working your way into it. And then this is showing again the side, and one thing I wanted to show here too is you can see these notches, and so this edge here will get faired down a little bit as you're fairing the hull, so you have to just kind of guess at how deep you want to make these. Especially up towards the front. And then the notches, the back side of those notches are not flush or parallel to this outer edge. You make them at an angle, so the batten fits at an angle there. I guess I didn't take a picture of the notches up front without the boards in them. And then this last picture shows well, this batten, how it's epoxied in, but then you can see how this one finally is, and I can see really slobbered some good epoxy in there. I do have a shim up in here because I had a gap that just ended up with, and I didn't want that. And then 3 screws, and so once that epoxy sets, it'll be very strong.